Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. I want to apologize for having to stand here because the wireless mic doesn't work. Normally I like to kind of work the crowd out this way, but forgive me for hiding behind a podium. I just want to give you a little context from our previous speaker. He talked about context, and so the context with me is I'm a ISO 27001 kind of consultant guy that works with small to medium-sized organizations, and then I tried to figure out a way to help them understand risk assessment. Okay? So from the context of my presentation, think of yourself as a small, medium-sized organization that has basically no IT or security support, and we're trying to do a risk assessment in order to identify what you need to do in terms of security controls. So that's the context. Before I get going, how about helping me with your context? How many of you are risk assessment specialists? Okay, please, as I'm going through this, as we talk, argue with me, only for a little bit because I have a time constraint, but feel free to interact. Questions, I don't want to wait to the end with questions, so as we go to the slides, I may say to you, I'm going to answer that in just a second, but talk to me. This is about trying to facilitate a conversation rather than me lecturing to you, okay? So if you kind of agree with that, how many are real management people who really don't know anything about risk assessment? Okay, I'll be talking to you a lot. And maybe listen to the other guys. So it's going to be in that context. Okay, so here we're going to do. First, we're going to have a little warm-up quiz. A few questions, true or false. Honestly, if you have a piece of paper, write down what your answers are, and then when we give the answers, let's see how well you did. If we had more time, I'd break you up into teams and see who wins, but we don't have time for that. Then I want to talk about why do we do risk assessments, the language of risk assessment, just like the previous speaker mentioned. We had the kids on the same wavelength. And then I'm going to walk you through the various steps within the risk assessment process. Might get a little laborious in there, but I'll promise to kind of move it fast. And then I'm going to kind of summarize with what I like to call a risk mitigation triangle. You give me some liberties there, but I'll kind of summarize it. A couple management types say to me, if you'd have just told me that in the beginning, I would have known what you wanted me to do during the last risk assessment. Okay, so it kind of summarize it, and then a couple of lessons learned, and then we'll be done. So again, interact with me. Okay, ready for the quiz? Here we go. Question 1, these are true or false? Conducting a risk assessment is optional for most organizations. Take a note. How about this one? Risk assessment is a decision support aid, not a decision-making tool. Risk assessment should focus around business processes or areas of responsibility rather than individual assets. I don't see any of you writing any answers down. Risk assessment has been used by some enterprises as rationale not to implement security controls. How about they're plagued by subjectivity, which means they're pretty much worthless. And last, the process can improve communication between various groups. Some of these seem straightforward, right? Others we may argue about. Okay. The only acceptable risk assessment is performed by the expert. Risk assessments only need to be done one time. Professionals are ultimately responsible for residual risk. I've had arguments with people about that one. If you don't have all the data, it's just a waste of time anyway. A proper risk assessment can help you prioritize spending. And the last one, risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives and can include both positive and negative responses. Okay, everybody have your answers? All right, now let's do it again. Okay, it's optional. How many think that's true? How many think it's false? False. It's really not optional. Even if you don't do a risk assessment, by the virtue of you not doing one, you have done one. And you're just not aware of the outcome. Make sense? Okay. How about this one? It's a decision support aid, not a decision-making tool. How many think that's true? How many think that's false? That's true. Nice. How about this one? You should focus on a business process or an area of responsibility rather than zeroing in on assets. How many think that's true? False? It's one or two. That's true. Again, just like the previous speaker we're talking about, where's the flow of your data? Where is your most critical data reside? Generally in a business process or an area of responsibility. Don't just go jumping in and risk assessing servers without knowing what's on them. Okay, how about this one? It has in fact been used by enterprises for rationale not to implement security controls. How many think that's true? Yeah, that is true. And again, that's not necessarily a negative thing, because in essence, certain risk levels you're not going to implement, right? How about this one? They're plagued by subjectivity, which means they cannot be relied upon. How many people think that's true? Very good. That's false. It can improve communication between different diverse organizations. True, right? Definitely. Well done. Okay, last couple. The only risk assessment, the only acceptable one is performed by the experts. How many think that's true? Very good. Risk assessments only need to be done one time. Anybody think that's true? That's not. How about this? Security professionals are ultimately responsible for accepting residual risks. How many of you think it's a security guy's problem to accept risk? Anybody? That's good, because it's not. Just like the previous speaker said, it is amazing though how many security guys I've talked to over time that think they own the risk and they're the ones making the decision. And I say, you're operating way above your pay grade, buddy, because it's not your decision. Okay. I'm sorry? That's right. That's right. And there are many business owners, product owners, who are more than willing to allow you to make the risk decision. Come to you and say, can I do this? Not our role to say whether you can or can't. Is to advise you of the various risks, right? If you don't have all the data, it's a waste of time. How many think that's true? Of course, that's false. You never have all the data, right? A proper risk assessment can help you prioritize security spending, right? Right? I mean, that's kind of why we named our company, Risk-Based Security. Did you have a question? Okay, feel free anytime. And the last one, risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives and can include positive and negative. That's, it's a hard concept to wrap our minds around. It is for me, because we always think risk meaning negative, but it's also positive. And that's really brought to light in the ISO standard 31000 that the previous speaker mentioned. Okay, so how'd you guys do? Experts? Okay, you will be at the end. Did you find it? Did you find it? There are plenty. Okay, so why do we perform risk assessments? Well, first of all, there are plenty of assets that need protecting, right? Now, again, many of us focus on the information assets, but there are assets everywhere, right? Physical assets, the information itself, the software, the services, supporting documentation, people, brand, culture. So, I mean, we have to look at the totality of the assets the organization is attempting to protect. And it's wide and diverse. And 27002 basically says, unless we identify what those are, their locations and their, quote, value, and we're going to talk about that, how can you assess the risk and decide how much time, money, and effort we should put around protecting them, right? So where are they? What are they? Not all assets are treated equal, should be treated equal, shouldn't be, I should say, nor do they need the same level of protection. But until you know what they are, an inventory of them, you're just shooting in the dark and perhaps wasting money. Okay, valuable information is everywhere. I'm probably missing some here. But from medical history and claims to account numbers, check images, PINs, passwords, you name it, it's everywhere. Yours is everywhere. And I want to show you a bit, and it is being exposed on a regular basis. Okay? Data types exposed. This is a chart from 2012 from data loss, our cyber risk analytics. You can see email, in almost 55% of all the data breaches in 2012 exposed email, followed by password, followed by other miscellaneous data points, and you can see is it going up. I want to show this chart very briefly. This is over time, what kind of data is being exposed. You can see on the top was name, and it's coming down, whereas email is on a sharp incline, also by password. And what we're seeing is, since many email addresses are being used as usernames in a lot of web applications, and our passwords, we're not real disciplined in that regard. We're using the same password for Facebook as we are using for our bank accounts. They're zeroing in on email addresses and passwords because there's a good chance that I can get real valuable stuff on you. So you can see how the attacks are going after the data that produces the greatest amount of opportunity. Okay? And of course, regulations and standards demand risk assessment. And this is only a partial list of those that say, hey, what's your risk assessment say? I spent some time in the financial world, and the examiners always walked in and said, okay, what did your risk assessment say? And that's what they're basing their exam on, and that's what they expect us to base our security controls and security program on. Today's realities, data breaches. This is out of our database. I did approximation for 2013, but look, this is the number of records. So in 2011, about 412 million records were exposed in the publicly reported data breaches. Okay? Publicly reported data breaches, which is probably just a small fraction of the real data breaches that actually occur. Okay? Now, let's look at this number. The red line represents the number of incidents, so the number of breaches themselves. And you can see that 2012 is an all-time record of over 3,100 publicly reported data breaches, which surpassed the all-time record before that in 2011 at around 1,200. So my point here is those trend lines are not leveling off, nor are they going down, and we all know that this isn't all the data breaches that are actually occurring. Okay? New exploits. So here we're talking about software, hardware vulnerabilities. So on average, over the last number of years, around 9,000 new vulnerabilities are in fact exposed, tracked, released, that we track in our database. But on a cumulative deal, we have about 92,000 software vulnerabilities that need to be handled. And we all know, especially I know I talked to a lot of you guys, just because it's old news doesn't mean it's been patched properly. So there's lots of exploits here, potential exploits, why we need to really assess our risk. And just a couple quick bullets. The need's never been higher. Anyone who captures, transmits any sensitive data, you are actively being targeted. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Even the small banks and credit unions that were under the radar for so long, they're not. They're a treasure chest of great data, money, cash, the whole 9 yards. We need a way in order to properly focus limited resources. We don't have unlimited resources to tackle everything, so how are we going to prioritize it? A risk assessment offers a great vehicle to be able to do that. We need justification for these recommendations and in business terms so that we can convince the people who manage our budgets that this is in fact what needs to be done. And then of course in our business environment, we can't afford costly, inappropriate controls. I've seen numerous times where they have elaborate controls around assets that are just not that valuable to the organization when it comes to being exposed. And then lastly, it can be thought of as kind of the first line of defense for implementing a security program. Okay, we're going to switch gears here a little bit, talk a little bit about definitions so that when we go through that, we're on the same page, at least a little bit. All right, so, of course, everybody knows the definition of information security, right? The preservation of CIA, some people say CIAA, adding accountability, but all these other terms. So what we're trying to avoid, of course, is a breach in CIA. That's the best way to kind of get that point across to the business manager, small business owner. And at the heart of all of that is a risk assessment, so you can properly know where these assets are and how you're going to focus on protecting them. First, some definitions. See if any of these, if you have others, I'd love to hear them. So we all hear this one. It's a combination, risk is, consequence of an event and the probability of that event. So I'm explaining this to a business manager, and they look at me, and they go, consequence, what are you talking about? Probability, how do I figure that out? How about impact times threat times vulnerability? Okay, well, what does that mean? Impact to the organization when a threat exploits a vulnerability. The effect of uncertainty on objectives, again, positive and negative, once again, coming out of the new 31,000. So then, what's a threat? A potential danger to an asset or business objective. A vulnerability is a weakness that provides a door for that threat to exploit the organization. And then a risk score is a potential impact to the business based on the likelihood of that threat agent taking advantage of that vulnerability. Okay, are we reasonable so far? I mean, the words may be a little bit different, but you kind of get the gist of how it comes together, right? Okay, now, the Chinese have two words for risk. Anybody know what they are? Opportunity is one. There we go. Danger plus opportunity makes a lot of sense. They were way ahead of ISO 31000 because it's both things. And that's part of growing a business. Okay, risk assessment. It's made up of three processes, and the previous speaker mentioned that. Risk identification, to find, recognize, and describe the risks. The analysis of those risks, understand what they are, the impact, the consequence, what level of risk there based on current controls. And then, of course, evaluation compares the analysis with what's determined an appropriate risk treatment, okay? Risk treatment, of course, we all know these options, right? You have risk, there are four options. You can avoid it, stop doing that causes that. You can transfer it, buy some insurance, and I'm sure there's insurance people here that would be glad to sell you some of that. Implement safeguards or controls, and then, of course, you get to the point where you're going to knowingly accept it as residual risk, right? Which is the next definition. It's what's left over after you've implemented a risk treatment or put a control in place, et cetera. Does that make sense? And it's that residual risk that management needs to acknowledge, be aware of, and knowingly accept. Okay. My personal definition, now here we're going to get into how I'm going to try to help you understand what we're talking about here, because right now it's just a bunch of academic stuff. All right, so I like starting out, risk is the combination of consequence of an event and the probability of that event happening. But okay, how do we really interpret that so we can use it? So consequence means the impact to the organization of a potential breach to CIA, okay? So if the availability is impacted, that's a consequence, and what does that do to the organization? Confidentiality, integrity. I kind of call that asset value. Here, I'm not talking about it's $1,000 to replace that item, et cetera. It's the impact to the organization, not the particular cost of that item, okay? That's contrary to some other risk assessment approaches who want to put a dollar value on the items, and I find it confuses the audience for this kind of conversation, or we call it the security impact, but let's right now use asset value. Probability is hard for most people to grasp if you leave it in one section. So the probability of a threat occurring is really two pieces. One, the threat likelihood. What is the likelihood of that threat impacting your asset? Times the probability of the exposure to that threat considering existing controls. Vulnerability exposure. Okay, so you have threat likelihood, and I want to go through this in more detail, and vulnerability exposure, and how we can control that. So that is, in fact, the formula. Risk equals asset value times threat likelihood times vulnerability exposure. Okay? So where do we get these numbers from? You know, how do we get these? Well, of course, if we had lots and lots of historical data, like maybe the insurance industry does, actuarial tables, things like that, we could do this in a real quantitative method. Real data, real numbers, not rankings. Well, that's not what we have in our business. We have more of what I like to call qualitative analysis. Some like to call it subjective, but I like the word qualitative a little bit better. But so we do use common terms. We will set up, 1 to 5, 1 to 10, low to very high, that type of thing. So it's relative risk that we're looking at, again, trying to separate the really high value assets from the real low value, and then, of course, those in between. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'm going to summarize the definition part with this. If you look at this picture, and based on the definitions we just talked about, do you see anything? Does any of this represent anything to anybody? I'll help you out. If this guy is considered the asset, or maybe the USB stick that's in his pocket is the asset, what else do you see there? What's that? And what are they? The threats, right? So we got some threats. There we go, got some threats. What else do you see? Line of vulnerability, yeah. Anything else? You got a control on the stick, right, exactly. So the vulnerability, could be he's got the wrong shoes on, or he's a little unsteady, or why in the world why is this process have him walking across this line anyway, right? We want to avoid this. Whatever it is he's trying to do doesn't make any sense. And yeah, I think a safeguard or a control would be the stick, right? Or even better one is to let him tightrope across some other kind of water without alligators and the ship and the boat being down there. So that's really what we're dealing with here. Okay, excellent. Okay, now let's get into the process of risk assessments, and bear with me through this one, okay? All right, so this is really how risk assessment works. You have all these steps, and then at the end, a miracle occurs, and you get a risk report, and that's what you give to management. That's how it works. Now, sometimes they say, we need a little bit more detail right here. And I like the heading, too, and I stole this from a guy I never heard of before, Ambrose. The risk assessment is kind of coming up with the best method of accomplishing an accidental result. And to me, that's kind of what this is. And by the way, once you do it once, you're going to accidentally do it again. But this kind of gives you some relative repeatability so you can compare last year's risk assessment to this one. So the process I'm going to walk you through doesn't have quite that many steps, but it does still arrive at the same accidental result. Okay, so here we go. First and foremost, we have to identify the business process or the department or the unit or whatever. We need a proper scope before we get into a risk assessment. Anybody disagree with that? We need to understand, we need to have it in the context as we talked earlier. If you try to say, I'm going to do a risk assessment of the whole company, you're dead, okay? You'll never get done, you'll never finish, it'll never be acceptable. You need to define what it is you're going to do, okay? And then, of course, within that process or scope, you need to identify the assets and go through that rating process, which I'm going to show you here in a second, to come up with the value. All assets are not equal, So you want to segregate them. You want to prioritize them. You want to identify the threats and, of course, the likelihood of the threat occurring. You want to identify, take inventory of your controls, which may be the first time you actually consider, hey, we're not doing bad. We're doing a lot of things. And you want to be able to take those into consideration when you come up with your analysis. Identify vulnerabilities and rate the potential exposure, right? So we're coming up with the formula that we were working on. Then we want to calculate that formula. Now that we've developed the risk scores, we can prioritize the higher ones to the lower ones, and we start with our limited resources and money, and we start fixing, as we can, the ones with the highest risk until we run out of money. And then we get to the point where management has to either give me more money or we're going to have to accept these risks, knowingly accepting these risks, right? And then, of course, define and accept those residual risks, and then magically the risk assessment report materializes, but then we have to then implement these controls. Yes, sir? Yes, and the red box is attempting to say that. Define what the acceptable risk is, your acceptable appetite, and then that determines your residual risk. Yes, that's the part that addresses that. Very important part, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, the thing in the middle with it kind of rotating means that you're kind of never done, right? It's just you're going around this thing as often as you can. And then, of course, once you put these controls in place, you are going to basically, out of control, lower your vulnerability exposure by virtue of that control, but then you have to test to see if it really worked, right? And I'm going to show you that. If I say my vulnerability exposure is a 5 and I do 2 controls, and now I think it's 2, did those controls really impact my vulnerability or not? So you have to think through security control test plans, okay, which is not a topic here, but nonetheless, it's not one done and leave it alone. You're constantly, it's a growing and living thing, okay? Now, I'm going to briefly go through each one of these boxes to kind of give you a thought of what we're doing here. So, when it comes to scope, it's basically system characterization, right? You're familiar with that word. What is the department, the business process? How does the information flow? Very key, right? How the information flows. Generally speaking, when you do that with a small business owner, it is an eye-opening experience because they have no idea where the information is coming from, who's doing what to whom. The requirements associated with it, people, users, you can see the rest. So in essence, you're trying to define what it is that you are in fact going to do a risk assessment on, okay? Now, how about assets? Here's a quick and dirty way of doing that. Okay, so I have asset name. I encourage them to say, okay, let's categorize, let's classify these assets. You know, is it public? Is it confidential? Is it just internal sensitive? You know, how do you want to guard these assets? And they're not all classified the same. Then we have 3 columns, CIA. Each of those columns goes 1 to 5, okay, 1 to 5. Simple, you go through and you say, okay, web server, depending on what's on it, of course. It's only sensitive data, not confidential. So in confidentiality, if I was breached, it would only be a medium impact to the organization. Integrity, it has more impact to the organization. And of course, availability, we're at a standstill if that thing's not available to me. You see, and these are decisions that the business owner makes. Not me, not a security guy, but generally the business owner, the product manager. And in this case, a simple average, okay? Simple arithmetic average. And so you picture this, inventory of assets. This helps you then say, if I'm going to spend money, I think I'm going to zero in on the online banking application because it's a 5 versus a 4 versus a 3. You with me? And so in the process, we would then filter those and get all the higher numbers to the top. And that's where we would start our analysis of threats and vulnerabilities. You with me? Simple-minded, you know, maybe mathematically it doesn't make sense to add and whatever, Maybe we should multiply. We can argue about that. I've seen both. Okay, now, here is where the qualitative part comes in. 1 to 5. We make these up. Okay? Let's start with 5. People always know what really would hurt them. So if I say that that asset is rated as a 5 for confidentiality, it means it's going to severely impact my operation, it's going to, et cetera, et cetera. You can read that. The one on the bottom, it's not really going to do much to me. And then, of course, we start negotiating 2, 3, and 4. You with me? To basically get varying degrees. And so we're attempting, in the asset value area, is to subjectively, right, qualitatively, zero in and rate each of those CIA. Make sense? Now, we can make these anything we want, whatever's comfortable to you, whatever fits your business model best. All right? These are your definitions, so you can rate them pretty well. It's not trying to understand, what do I mean by this? It's what you mean by it. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, let's talk about threats. Now, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of threats that we can come up with. Here's just a quick spattering of threats. In fact, I always like to use the natural disasters, hurricanes, and I'll use that as an example here a little bit. But you can see these are things that can possibly threaten the CIA of our data. And we want to determine whether or not these have any potential impact, if matched against a vulnerability, to a particular asset. Okay? Make sense? An organization may have a different list or a combination or others. Same thing here. Now we have to determine the threat likelihood of that particular threat. I'll use an easy example. I live on the coast of Florida, so let's say the threat is a hurricane. The likelihood of a hurricane impacting my data center is probably very high, right? Certainly, well, maybe not. It's like likely to occur multiple times per week. That's not really the case. It's more likely, depending on the time of the year, more like maybe monthly, whatever. So you can zero in with real numbers that you make up from very low to very high and be able to use what that means, the likelihood of that threat occurring. Okay? Now, of course, the threat of hurricane isn't going to have the same likelihood of occurrence in Omaha, but they have different issues like tornadoes, or floods, or whatever. You with me? And so we can kind of zero in on the threat likelihood. Same way about hacking or anything else. All right, now, this is the easy one. Before you look at your vulnerability, you want to take inventory of the controls that you have in place. So here I am, a data center. I'm on the beach, in Jacksonville Beach with my data center, and I'm thinking about hurricanes. What controls do I have in place? I don't know. Do I have concrete walls, Do I have insurance? What are the things that I'm trying to reduce the vulnerability, and the list of controls that you have in place need to be addressed. Now let's talk vulnerability. Remember this, it's a weakness that might be exploited by a threat, right? Here are just a quick sampling of these times, from inadequate fire prevention to insufficient training, security controls, testing, etc. And again, here, vulnerability exposure. Again, I'm making these up with the business owner. Very low vulnerability exposure, because the vulnerability is very hard to exploit, or the security controls in place to protect the asset are very strong. Okay? So let's think about, I'm on the shore of the ocean, I'm in my data center, I'm talking about hurricanes, but I have a concrete building, right? And all my important stuff is on the second floor with no windows. Okay, so my vulnerability exposure in that particular scenario is a little different than being in a wooden structure at the end of a pier. You see what I'm saying? So a very simple example, but that's how we can rate this between I am highly vulnerable or I'm not very vulnerable. Does that make sense? Again, the same 1 to 5 that I make up, that you make up, that you understand, so that when you do this risk assessment again next year, you can compare it to one you did before, because it's not something a consultant told you about, it's what you created. Okay, now, let's look at this real fast. Calculating the risk score. Remember my favorite formula is asset value times threat likelihood, vulnerability exposure. So here we go. We have an asset ID, because we're going to get down to the assets within the scope. It's brief description, and remember how we calculated the asset value before, right? CIA and how it's exploited. Then we have the threat likelihood 1 to 5, right? Then we name the vulnerability and what its exposure is. And then, of course, we multiply the 3 together, and underneath of that score, we're going to have a number, right? And that number is going to be somewhere on a chart like this, right? The maximum that it can be is 125, right? 5 times 5, 125. You can make those numbers anything you want. I had a argument with a NCUA examiner one time. He said, oh, because you're only going 1 to 5 on the value, it's not the same because you got 1 to 25 on the probability. I go, what? So he wanted me to make the 1 to 5 on the value 1 to 25. So now my number is 625. And I'm going, okay, whatever you want. But it's a relative thing to help you segregate and prioritize, okay? Now, the colors. So let me ask you this. Well, this organization was yours. What is your risk appetite? What number? No, but this is your business. And these numbers and this legend over here, okay, tells you what your acceptable risk level is. So what's my risk appetite? What number? 40, right? Because that's the highest number that I'm saying I'm going to accept. Although I'm going to keep my eye on it, I'm going to accept it. So in essence, management has concluded that anything between 1 and 125 that's 40 or below, I'm going to accept that risk. So my job is that anything above 40, I'm going to try to implement a security control, or I'm going to avoid it, right, or I'm going to transfer it. I'm going to try to lower that to the acceptable risk level. Does that make sense? Okay, now let's see how we do that. Now here's another example, a little more simplistic in nature. Instead of using 1 to 5, we're just using low, medium, and high. A lot of organizations do this, low, medium, and high. So you can see here, over on the threat likelihood, is this low, medium, and high. Vulnerability exposure, low, medium, and high. And then asset value, we kept that as very low up to very high. So in essence, what we're trying to determine, let's say my threat likelihood is high, my vulnerability exposure we judge as medium, and then of course the impact of the organization is high, that says that my risk is high. There are organizations that use this very simple, non-numbered approach to figure out how to prioritize their risks. Make sense? You follow the flow I'm trying to create here? All right, let's talk about risk treatment plan. What is a risk treatment plan? That always throws a lot of people. What does that mean? Well, if we start with the risk calculation over here, and again, that's that risk score that came from the previous box, and then we decide what is our treatment. Remember those? Avoid, transfer, accept, or, control. And then we always want to say, if you're going to transfer it or accept it, what's your rationale? Why'd you do that? And then, if we're not going to accept or transfer, we're going to control it. What is the control you're going to implement? And when you implement a control, your vulnerability exposure number changes, right? Otherwise, why would you do it? You want to reduce your vulnerability exposure by adding this control, whether it's training or firewall, whatever it might be. That means you have a new risk score, right? Because now I've gone from a 4 vulnerability, I've gone maybe down to a 3. So 3 is the number that's going to automatically, by the calculation, lower your risk score. Is it 40 or below? Not quite. I have to consider another control. You with me? We're trying to narrow that vulnerability gap, okay? All right. And then, of course, Over here, which doesn't show very well, you have what is your action going to be, who's going to own it, and what's the target date to implement. Okay? All right. All right, so reviewing residual risk, it is management responsibility. As a security professional, we need to work with management to help them understand what it is and what it means and help them to define it. And then, of course, each company, like the gentleman said, I don't know, what's my company? What do I do, right? It depends on, compliance, responsibility, threats, et cetera. Okay. Quickly on the risk assessment report, I want to get to a couple other things, and I'm running out of time. Basic introduction, the scope. So when you're turning in a report that somebody, external party is going to review, or even manager is going to review, you need to understand what the scope is. Remember that characterization part. Identify your approach, which is kind of what we just kind of went through, and then the various results. Okay? All right, so implementing risk treatment plans. Here are just 3 quick examples. Say one of my tasks is going to be the presentation to the board about the results. That's going to be there because I'm going to probably need money. So we define who the owner is. We attempt to estimate how many man days this is going to involve. A priority, 1, 2, 3. We're still about those priorities, guys, because we only have limited resources. And then, obviously, you manage the percent complete and the comments. So that kind of wraps that part up. All right, so here's what I want to get to. In summary, if I only have 1 slide to talk to you about risk assessment, this will be it. So bear with me here. Everybody understand the formula here, right? Asset value, threat likelihood, vulnerability exposure. If you give me some latitude and say that the multiplication of that equals risk, and risk is represented by the area under the triangle, okay? Now, I have no idea if that would be mathematically correct, but just bear with me that that's representing that. What am I really trying to do? What can I do? Can I really change the asset value? Maybe over time, things become less sensitive, right? But right now, I can't do anything about asset value. Can I change the threat likelihood of a hurricane in Florida? Can I do anything about that? So what am I left to do? Vulnerability exposure. I've got to change my vulnerability exposure. So I implement a control. And by implementing that control, I've changed the area under the triangle. Now what I'm trying to depict here is that the threat likelihood line has remained the same length, okay? And I'm trying to just bend it over. I'm bending it over to reach this line, which now represents a shorter vulnerability exposure. Make sense? And then, of course, I do it again, and then perhaps again, and again, and I'm down here to a different risk. But what about that risk? Is it an acceptable level of risk? And of course, you would do that each time you add a control, come up with a new risk score, and am I at or below my vulnerability, my acceptable risk level. Does that make sense? This, in essence, is what we're really trying to do, setting priorities and spending those limited resources. Okay. Some lessons learned. All businesses or all processes do not have the same impact, right? Very much so. Critical information assets include more than just IT assets. It's not just an IT deal, it's a management deal. Information assets are not valued the same. Risk scores help us prioritize our decisions. Lowering risk scores is really a cost-benefit analysis or exercise, because these security controls don't come free, right? They come with some level of cost. And it's important for business and IT to acknowledge the responsibility of risk ownership. And you guys got that question right. It is not the IT/security guy or gal's responsibility to accept risk, to guide the organization of how to change the exposure to lower the risk, but they're not in the position to say, well, we'll accept that risk. No, it's a business owner, right? And then it does require some consistent terminology, and it's really a foundation for decision making. Okay. All right, so remember, risk assessment is more about heading in a direction than it is perfection. I've talked to so many people who say you would never be able to determine the asset value of this, and this, so therefore it's a waste of time. It's not true. We're not coming up with a value necessarily. We're coming up with a priority ranking of where this asset is more important than this one. Does that make sense? Okay? And there's no perfect risk assessment. I mean, just trying to do a risk assessment and then you fumble with every element here, that's okay. The level of education and training and communication that is going to take place is going to be phenomenal, and your organization will be better off. And besides, as soon as you spend those 3 months doing that risk assessment, it's obsolete anyway, because emerging threats have occurred or whatever. So it's not about what they say in real estate. It's location, location, location. And when we're talking about, it's get going. You're heading in the right direction, not worrying about perfection. Okay. And that summarizes, and hey, I got 2 minutes left. So I appreciate your time. If you have any questions or comments, or you want to argue with me, please, trying to get educated and figure out a way to help communicate this basic process to other people. I'm done. Thank you very much.